Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Streamlining Compliance for Greater Efficiency with AWS and DuploCloud. Excited to talk to you guys about all things security and compliance. My name is Anna Croft, and I am going to be your moderator today. I am a Senior Security Partner Strategist with the Global Security and Compliance Acceleration Program at AWS. So I work all things and I help with all things security and compliance and helping startups, enterprise companies navigate kind of the complex requirements that are important. Over to Lance to give a quick intro.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lance Udasco. I've been working in the AWS space for about 8 years now. Have both a professional certification, security specialty, ISO 27001 lead implementer, and CISP. I'm not trying to impress anyone on this call. I just want you to be confident that I'm a qualified individual when we speak of information security.
Awesome, thank you. And Kevin, I'll toss it over to you now.
Thanks, Anna. Kevin Donahue, also a Senior Security Partner Strategist on the GSCA team alongside Anna. We help get customers who are needing security and compliance assistance in touch with awesome partners like Duplo. With 5 years, and on the GSCA team almost a year.
Why? There's a couple different reasons why compliance is important, but really it allows you to demonstrate that you as a company meet and are able to meet security requirements and are basically able to protect customers' data and ensures that trust and security in your company and customers. So as you can see, it protects consumers and financial systems, these regulatory requirements. So it's a really big thing that we try to talk to startups about. Like, as you're starting out, as you're building even your SaaS product, you need to think about what security and compliance is going to look like and needs to look like for your company. Oftentimes, we also see that maintaining compliance is essential for business sustainability and growth. There have been plenty of times when I've talked to startups that basically say, hey, our VC is telling us that we need to meet a SOC 2 requirement in order to get funding. So this is going to be, these requirements are going to pop up. And if you don't think ahead of time, and if you don't kind of build them into your plan, then it can be kind of off-putting and it can be kind of a shock, and it's not going to be necessarily a ton of fun. So that's what we're here for. That's what DuploCloud's here to help with, and to show you that compliance isn't really that scary, and it's important and we can get through it pretty quickly. So with that, I will toss it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Anna. Am I doing the compliance is hard slide, or digging in compliance is hard?
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks. It is you're a smaller company that's just getting started on AWS or any other cloud system in general. Essentially, like we recommend that the earlier you get started thinking about it, the better. You want to secure your data, whether you're beholden by a regulator or a customer that a compliance certification. Either way, you want your S3 buckets to be locked down. You want your workloads to be secure because you have proprietary data or you have customer data. So what gets complex is when we see our customers' businesses start to grow and they didn't really account for compliance up front. And they are then beholden to various different complex compliance framework, executive privacy, cost can balloon. And then, of course, as far as resources and expertise, we don't expect, some of our smaller customers or even mid-sized customers to have really robust security operations and risk and compliance teams. So, we work with those types of customers in collaboration with partners like Duplo to help make it a little bit more digestible and more cost effective. Next slide, please. So how working, and also from the AWS services themselves, a lot of the standards, if you're not familiar with them, are not prescriptive to any given technology. And so it's pretty difficult sometimes to interpret different controls and apply them in a hyperscale environment with many different, the control. AWS provides a wide variety of resources that sort of map what the security configurations that you should be thinking about based on whichever services you're looking at. And then also operationally with tools like Security Hub and Audit Manager and others, they have mappings to compliance checks to many different compliance frameworks. And those are a great way to start with, sort of benchmarking and maybe running one of those conformance packs or audit manager packs in your account just to see, if you have any glaring issues. It's also a great way to get ready for audits. But one of the things that we recommend starting out with, if you're just starting to think about compliance, is working backwards from the controls that you implement yourselves, and then how those map to compliance standards. So a lot of our more mature. Okay, next slide, please. So some of the benefits of pursuing compliance in AWS, enhanced security and trust. They go hand in hand. If you're doing security well, then you want to earn trust by compliance certifications and pursuing those so that you can earn trust with your customers. And then on the other side, operational efficiencies, that kind of goes hand in hand with what I mentioned about the common controls. Once you start to identify those key cornerstone security practices that you're doing, you can implement them in a repeatable way. You can deploy new AWS accounts in the same way, using the same controls. And so it starts to get a little bit easier from an efficiency standpoint for new deployments, new workloads, new customers. And then market expansion, like specifically going back to ISO versus SOC 2, those are just two compliance frameworks that you can think about from a business pursuit and customer pursuit and earning trust standpoint. Like, do you have plans to expand internationally in the next year or two, maybe you want to start with something like ISO, or maybe, and then out into the field and seeing what your competitors might be advertising or communicating to customers in terms of which security certifications they have, which cloud service providers they're using. They might be, marketing, their security and compliance posture, and we want to help you be able to do the same thing. And we can talk to you about that as well.
All right, I believe this is where I'm going to take over. So I wanted to help establish a definition of what information security is. I feel like everyone sort of has an understanding broadly of what they think it is, but it's hard to really capture in words. So I like to use something that I used with my father-in-law, and I thought it really helped him. Let's go to the next slide here. So this is the CIA triad, right? So when we talk about information security, these are the three pillars that we're talking about: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Confidentiality is an obvious one, right? If you don't have permissions to see that data, you can't see it. Integrity comes up, I think, less often because it can be a little more subtle. So to give an example, foreign nation states have been known to hack news websites and insert false stories, right? Now affecting the integrity because you can't trust the data that's on that site. And then availability, most commonly ransomware, but with security events, it's important to keep in mind they don't always have to be malicious. So if anyone remembers the names Microsoft and CrowdStrike, you'll know that the biggest availability impacting disaster recovery event in history was non-malicious. Someone just made a mistake, right? So just keep that in mind. Security is not just against malicious. It's not just about malicious actors, but really anything that can impact these three pillars. Move on. So I want to talk about how DuploCloud, as your partner, approaches the migration effort that we're taking together, right? And that together thing will come up later as we talk about shared responsibility. But we really have to work with you to understand a lot of aspects about the workload that you're going to be deploying on AWS, right? Obviously we need to understand your application, right? We want to know how that works. But then what about everything that goes with that? Identity management, access control, logging strategies. That's your AAA services. So it's basically authentication, authorization, and auditing. So who are you? What can you do? And a year from now, can I go and look at logs and see what you did do, right? And then beyond that, network security, encryption, disaster recovery, right? We want to understand your recovery point and recovery time objectives, right? How long can you afford to be down and how much data can you afford to lose, right? That can be the difference between a backup and restore DR scenario or a pilot light or even active-active, right? Hardening requirements, that could be OS and container layer. There is also, of course, hardening at the AWS layer, which we help you with, and we have established baselines using tools like AWS Security Hub and Config. But then how are we going to handle patch management, right? And scanning for vulnerabilities. Windows updates no one loves. Sometimes they go wrong, like other updates I mentioned earlier, but they keep you safe, right? So how do you do that in an environment where perhaps you're auto-scaling EC2 hosts, right? Your virtual machines, how do you patch those? And then we get into endpoint protection, right? So if you need any sort of antivirus, integrity monitoring, intrusion prevention, and then monitoring and alerting, right? Continued operations, right? Basically giving you the ability to know when there's a problem before you hear it from your customer, because no one ever wants to be in that situation. Okay. We can move on. All right, thank you. So we align with certain security foundations and frameworks. We obviously have to take into account first and foremost what applies to your or our customer's organization, right? So regulatory, statutory, contractual compliance requirements, right? Contractual compliance requirements can and sometimes do supersede regulatory compliance requirements, right? Regulatory may be bare minimum, whereas a contract with a customer may require much more, let's say, in the way of disaster recovery. Again, SLAs, better SLAs, right? Things like that. So we really have to understand the requirements from all those areas. And then as we build, we're aligning with the cloud adoption framework, the AWS well-architected framework, and then the shared responsibility model. That is an important point. And I think if we go to the next slide, we should have a diagram there. Yep. So a lot of people think that if they're in AWS, they're compliant, they're secure. It's AWS. They have attestations of compliance. To a degree, that is partially true. AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud, right? So they have a cloud, Amazon owns that cloud, and they're responsible for the security of that cloud. But when you have your workload in that cloud, that comes with certain responsibilities as well, right? We talked earlier about patching, right? How do you it's not Amazon's responsibility to ensure that your Windows server is up to date on patches, right? There's services that can certainly help with that, but that's still your responsibility to implement. Things like disaster recovery as well, security, network security, right? These are all things that as a customer, you have the flexibility to configure for better or for worse, sometimes right and sometimes wrong, right? So as we build through this, we help customers understand, hey, this is where AWS's responsibility lies. Your responsibility is here. And as your partner, this is what we can take over for you, right? Typically, our responsibility would end at application layer, right? You have to bring your own developers who know your application. Kevin, I don't know, did you want to add anything? Being with AWS, did you want to kind of come on top of that and add anything else?
Yeah, sure, Lance. So I would say that, there's a variety of different documentation and resources that are available that explain this more in depth. Like this could vary, this depiction, based on the services that you're using. So check out the service user guides as well as customer compliance guides. And we can share a link after the fact. But if you really want to get into the weeds a little bit, we have some resources for you.
Okay, so to go back to some of the compliance frameworks we talked about earlier, like SOC 2, ISO 27001, I wanted to give some examples here of how AWS can help, right? Obviously, they know what they have to do for security of the cloud, but they do give guidance for how to secure within the cloud, right? So Kevin mentioned this earlier. There's a service, AWS Audit Manager, that actually has publicly available documentation that helps you map best practices based on Amazon config rules to certain security controls. So here I've taken some examples from SOC 2 and ISO 27001 to show, and I got this directly off AWS's public site. You don't have to actually log into the console to get this. I have the control IDs, supporting config rules. Keep in mind, there's likely many config rules, right? These are AWS best practices. Many config rules can be tied to a control, and each config rule can be tied to multiple controls, right? So we look at, these are the names, instance backed up, right? Or your databases being backed up, right? That goes to recovery. S3 lifecycle policy, right? It's always good to have an expiration policy on all of the data, because if you are hacked, let's say, data that doesn't exist can't be compromised, right? So expired data, once you don't need it anymore, private image scanning goes to vulnerability management. But then as we get into ISO, you could see I included DB instance backup enabled again, right? And as Kevin mentioned, as you grow larger, it may become easier to have a common set of controls that you can then map to different frameworks to just make it easier to use the evidence you already have to achieve additional attestations, right? So AWS does provide guidance, even though it is your responsibility to implement. So as your partner, we rely heavily on this documentation to make sure, whether you have a GRC tool plugged in like Vanta or ThoroughPass, right? We can still use AWS tools to really meet the same goals and achievements. Before we build, we like to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we are building. So as part of that, after we go through our discovery and understanding, we put together high-level architecture diagrams, right? So that you understand, hey, this is what we're building towards, and we're all on the same page. And then once we get to the build phase, this is really where our DevOps as a service abilities really start to benefit the customer. Instead of the old-fashioned ClickOps way of building or launching AWS resources through the console, we use the DuploCloud platform to establish a certain baseline and then leverage additional infrastructure as code to put in some of the customized services, which give you version control and other benefits that come along with having CI/CD pipelines in place. Let's see. So our general process follows this. We would build a landing zone, right? This is essentially the secure baseline. Before you start to deploy any services, we want to make sure that the AWS cloud where you'll be putting your workloads is hardened, right? I mentioned that earlier. We want to make sure there's MFA on users. We're deleting some of the default networking configurations, really some of the biggest items that can trip you up and cause unnecessary exposure, right? So we build that landing zone. We start to implement the access controls, the security services, so we can begin to measure, right? Where is there drift from this compliance baseline? So we're looking at things like Security Hub and config. We then start to deploy your network architecture. Sometimes you may have a shared services account where let's say Active Directory can be centrally released from multiple different accounts. So let's say you have stage, dev, production, something like that. We begin to build your pre-production architecture, go through CI/CD integrations, build out your AMIs, your container building pipelines for customers who are using containers. And then we deploy and validate any of the POCs that we identified earlier on during the sales process. And then we can get to production implementation. And hopefully, because we've done everything else beforehand, we've been monitoring and measuring security controls and security scores as we go, right? Deploying production should just be a matter of, some minor modifications to the infrastructure-as-code templates, right? And then redeploying to a new environment. After that, we would test, get the monitoring in place, logging, DR, test failover, make any adjustments for operational compliance. And then finally, we can do a final cutover. And then we go into monitoring, right? Controls monitoring and continuous improvement. I wanted to talk about the continuous improvement. I think this, a lot of people don't necessarily consider this at first because they're so focused on getting the compliance attestation in the first place. But that continuous improvement is a big part of compliance, right? You're likely going to have audits every year. You have to show that you're measuring, you're doing internal audits, you're constantly making improvements to your processes, right? Because nothing's perfect and none of us get this exactly right, our first crack at it. Right. So you want to keep going, keep getting better. I know this is ISO 27001, but SOC 2 is very similar.
Kevin, we're going to toss it back to you now.
Thanks, Anna. So a little bit about our Global Security Compliance Acceleration Program here at AWS. This program was sort of born out of the federal government. It used to be called ATO on AWS, which is short for Authorization to Operate. It's similar, another compliance requirement standard that government customers need to abide by. But then we've since expanded in the last couple of years to more global compliance frameworks, so covering financial services, healthcare, public sector, and privacy frameworks. So I think it's roughly about 25 to 30 different frameworks and variants that we can have conversations with and specialize, discussing these with customers and then finding the right partner like Duplo to work with them. So next slide, please. So we're a team of security experts. Most of us have, hands-on technical expertise from the implementation side of things, and especially in audits. A lot of ex-Big Four folks on our team, and then we, like I said, help connect with customers, partners like DuploCloud, who need specialized advisory and technology support services, and we also manage a variety of third-party assessment organizations as well. Whereas, like if Duplo is helping a customer out on the technical DevSecOps implementation side of things, we can then refer an audit partner there as well to help you achieve your SOC 2 or your ISO 27001. There's a short questionnaire that we'll link to and send it out to the group after, but always happy to set up a quick intro call with our team and listen to any challenges or questions that you might have as it relates to security and compliance on AWS.
Yeah, and I did just want to add as well, you can also find us on AWS Marketplace. So we have been working over the past couple months to essentially put together end-to-end compliance solution bundles on AWS Marketplace. So if you are told you have to get a SOC 2 or decided you need to go down that path and you just have no idea where to start, no idea what partners to work with, no idea where to get started, you can reach out to our team, and then we have these partner bundles that essentially are an end-to-end compliance solution, from advisory to auditors, are included in that bundle, and they will, for one price, one easier transaction, you can go ahead and purchase that and basically essentially get you to that SOC 2 attestation that you're looking for. So we will also send that out, or if you have any questions on those bundles, just reach out to our team email that we linked below. But that's something we're seeing a lot of customers move towards, especially younger startups, because the bundles are also more advantageous for pricing. So DuploCloud does participate in that as well. So they do have something listed on AWS Marketplace with us. So